Continuing our series about Amiga exclusives, for both those who had an Amiga back then and these who'd like to know what were the games on it that never released on other systems, I'm back with another episode, and hopefully you'll enjoy today's selection. Even if a bit on a tough side, at least to me, ATR All-Terrain Racing is one of the best overhead racers on the Amiga. That difficulty though is not unfair, let me make that clear. It's not cheap and it's not there to discourage you from playing. On the contrary, it's there to have you learn how each of the vehicles work, how tracks and their surfaces respond to your chosen car, and so that you could memorize all of them. All the turns and obstacles, everything. It's a racer that rewards perseverance, and doing all that will take a lot of time, and I mean it, a lot. But it will be time well spent having fun, and especially that the ATR can be experienced by up to 6 players on a single Amiga. Sure, so many may require a hardware add-on, but the more the merrier, and it's one of those games that may actually justify purchasing one. There's 42 different tracks in the game divided into 6 unique terrain categories, with 3 of them available from the start: Sports, Forest and Canyon, and the Space, Moon and Alien unlocked by completing all the tracks in the former 3. ATR gives you a choice of 3 vehicles, of 4x4 Jeep, which is used here more as a description of the car rather than the brand, Buggy, which kinda explains itself, and Formula. And yeah, it too is self-explanatory. All of them can be upgraded in between the races with better engine, tires and so on. And it's not optional, I must add, as your opponents, even CPU controlled, will be definitely doing it too. While single-player arcade mode is all about racing and getting better at controlling cars and learning the circuits, the multiplayer mode is an all-out crazy mayhem. Why? Because you get weapons, and trust me, playing fair will not get you far in this one. Graphics and sounds, as you can see, are perfect. They may not be genre-defining or even the best on the Amiga, but they're definitely out there at the very top, hanging with the most stylistically polished games. So the presentation definitely runs up the game as a complete package. ATR, however, came out in an odd time. 1995 was a year when Commodore's been already long bankrupt, Amiga moved between many different owners like some kind of a radioactive hot potato, and the developers couldn't really expect the platform to last much longer, so less and less care was given to games released on the system. ATR is an exception. It's extremely polished and playable. It also received a port to the infamous CD32, which frankly speaking was a joke, as it added nothing. It was virtually the same disc version of the game, but on a CD. All that aside though, if you like top-down racers, there's hardly any better. Same as ATR, Behind the Iron Gate came out in 1995, an odd year for the Amigas as we've already established, but even more so as it was one of the very first serious attempts at Doom-like games on the system, and it spawned in the time when we knew that Doom was impossible on the Ami because of how its graphical chips operated, and a bit before we realized that some people could make impossible possible. So being one of the first few, Behind the Iron Gate was rather rough in its presentation. It had no textured objects, no walls, ceilings or floors had them, and neither did the enemies. Everything was devoid of detail and color, as the game seemed to pick one color per stage and then render everything in its shade, which not only looked weird but also not very eye-pleasing. I'm Batman! I see. Yep. Okay. So, Bruce is asking me to tell you that he too made everything in one color, funeral black, and that it worked. So it's not the idea, but the choice of colors that was the issue in his eyes. It's unimportant. All he ever was good at was catching criminals and eating puddings. He doesn't know about video games. So, coming back to Behind the Iron Gate, it's obviously a first-person shooter. It takes place in a futuristic prison. Your aim, as the title suggests, is to open the gates, carry on through the game to eventually get to the place where you'll be able to initiate a self-destruct sequence. From then onward, you have to escape before the whole complex explodes. Interestingly enough, while the game doesn't feature a visible weapon on the screen and just a crosshair, it does have a mouse-controlled hovering hand that's used for small bits of adventuring, like opening doors or picking up objects. Which, and I have no proof of that whatsoever, leads me to believe that perhaps at some early stages of development it was supposed to be a dungeon-crawling RPG and not an FPS. But whatever, it is what it is. It's worth noting that the game ran on all Amigas with 1 MB of RAM, so at least its requirements were not unreasonable. While the music that accompanies the gameplay is exceptional compared to the rest of the presentation, it's hardly enough to save this, brace yourselves, disappointingly boring and unexceptional title. It looks bland, plays below par, switching weapons is a chore I never really got entirely hang of, and the movement is not perfect either. It's a first attempt, and as that, it's interesting. But it's not a good game. Also, I fulfilled the promise from the first episode in the series. Not all games will be good, but all will be interesting. If you're a long-time viewer of this channel, then you've no doubt heard of Benefactor already. It's a game I seem to be mentioning whenever there's even an imaginary reason for it, just to slide it into the conversation. That's how good it is. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Benefactor is a very unique puzzle platformer. It's a cross between Lemmings, Sleepwalker and a generic platformer of yore, with all the tropes that this entail. So platforms, ladders, risky jumps, enemies, obstacles and hazards, you get the gist. And while it may sound like an odd, even questionable mixture, it's so well designed, programmed and put together that you will not bother yourself with pondering about its origins and will just keep playing. Until you give up, that is. Because as much fun as it is, it's equally as punishing. It's a tough one, and the difficulty curve is rather challenging. To me at the very least. And Benefactor really demands your full attention, nimble fingers and keen mind. While I can pretty much always give you the 2 out of the 3 all at once is not something that happens to me often. Anyway, you control a small, just a few pixels in size character, named with the wordplay on the title, Benefactor, and his task in each and every level is to save the tiny red creatures, that more often than not are locked away somewhere. Just like in Lemmings, it's all about getting them to safety. Each level is a different logic and platforming puzzle, and each will put your skills to the test. When you unlock the cell the little red dudes are locked in, they proceed to direct themselves straight towards the exit, taking the shortest possible route. Not necessarily the safest, and this is where you come in. Cause same as in the aforementioned Sleepwalker, you'll have to make sure that they'll leave the stage unscathed. To do so, you can pick them up, carry them and throw them. And you will have to, as the path to safety is often a dangerous or locked off one. So you will need to toss them left and right like a ragdoll towards smaller openings that they can pass through, switches that they can toggle, and around the dangers, animated or otherwise, that they would no doubt just walked into. Benefactor is a game that's best understood when played and not watched or talked about. As what may seem at first glance as unimpressive, sometimes is so incredibly rewarding you wouldn't believe. Especially when you figure out the solution to a particularly difficult problem. So, if you ever get a chance, definitely try Benefactor out. Oh, and the presentation is stellar too, in all departments, be it sounds and music or tiny cutesy detailed graphics. It's great. I didn't own or play Banshee when it originally released back in the day. It required an Amiga 1200 and its dreamy AGA chipset, and I was stuck with my worn-out A500. Now, I know that AGA was at best an iterative upgrade, but back then, to my oblivious teenage self, it seemed like a huge step up capable of competing with PC's VGA graphic cards on all fronts. It was hardly the case, however, but it's something for the computer history textbooks and not this video. What it was, though, is an interesting time in home computing, when the tides turned and it began to be painfully obvious that Amiga lost all of its competitive edge. Gaming started turning into 3D, and Commodore's machines' custom chips were just not built for that. At all. Anyway, I'm rambling, let's get back to our game at hand. Banshee was one of the games that didn't care about 3D, and placed all its proverbial chips on a good old classic 2D vertical shooting action. And it was an excellent bet. And also a win. Sure, it may have come out a bit late, but it represented the shoot-em-up genre like a boss. The graphics were a pure explosion of 16-bit eye candy goodness. Beautifully crafted in a mix of steampunk and World War II style, all drowning in various shades of brown, to highlight set influences no doubt. A true sight to behold, even if few years too late to the party. And no wonder, as it was made by Core Design. And any former Amiga owner will tell you that their games not only looked incredible, but also had that very specific, easily distinguishable from others' graphic style that was just unmistakable. I mean, they were one of the first, if not the first Amiga developer that broke the 256 colors barrier on the basic 1MB OCS ECS system, something that designers of the Amiga themselves deemed impossible. And yet, Core Design made it happen. Anyway, what's worth mentioning, since we're already on the presentation, is that sheer amount and variety of enemies and potential innocent victims on the screen at once, all smoothly animated and complemented by neat little death/destruction animations. Banshee may have run at 25 FPS only, but it was filled to the brim with neat little graphical touches, details that many will never notice unless studying the game up close. It was incredible. Sounds, however, aside from few little enjoyable bits here and there like death screams and explosions, are nothing to write home about. They're workable, but in the end, that's all you could really expect from a shoot-em-up. Banshee is an excellent game, worth owning, and if that's not possible, then at least worth playing, even if emulated. Base Jumpers is a weird action platformer. Not weird because how it's played, though the premise is very unusual and not something I've seen in any other title, but because of how black and white it is, with no grey to it, so to speak. Meaning it's incredible, super fun and hella addicting when played with others, and in the same time, boring and uninspired when played alone. It may just be me, but for me it's exactly how it feels. Like a game made to be a party title that there's absolutely no reason to touch when you're alone. If you disagree, make sure to let me know in the comments below. Base jumpers can be played by a maximum of 4 players, and while it's not necessary, a 2 is a minimum, a low bar necessary to enjoy it. The game is played in buildings, and each is unique, located in a different geographical locale, and has to be climbed. Climb is a big and not necessarily well-fitting word, so let me clear that up. You have to scale them from the very bottom to the top in this genuinely unique vertically scrolling platformer, as fast as you can, against the clock, preferably with all your lives and energy intact. All the buildings are filled with thematically appropriate enemies patrolling, and you have to either avoid them or dispose of them Mario style, by jumping on their heads. Which, if you really think about it, is extremely violent, because not only you're breaking in the building, but also jumping on heads of those who do their job trying to stop you. It got dark quickly, so better ignore the last 2 or 3 sentences. While you fight your way up defeating enemies, every now and then they will drop a letter, and these have to be picked up and arranged in 3 letter combinations to receive bonuses. These are different and aplenty and can range from points through extra lives all the way to the special bonus stages. When you finally reach the top, it's time when the game's title will begin to make sense, because you're gonna give it justice by base jumping off the building. Regardless how many people actually play the game, there's always 4 jumpers, and the CPU takes control of these that are not human. As you fall down, gaining velocity rapidly, you need to dodge flagpoles and overhands and avoid being pushed into them by your fellow base jumpers. Or enemy base jumpers, I should say, really, cause clearly they do not wish you any good. Your aim is to reach the ground first, intact, which in multiplayer is not as easy as it sounds, but also where most of the fun of the game comes from. If you have someone else to play it with, I can wholeheartedly recommend base jumpers, but if you're alone, then it's not really worth your time, I'm afraid. Following the universally beloved and not exclusive original, the Chaos Engine 2 is a simultaneous 2-player top-down arcade shooter, and sadly, nowhere near as good of a game as the first was. Don't get me wrong though, it's not a bad one whatsoever, it's just way below the expectations of gamers after the incredible first outing. This time our 4 heroes are trapped in time, after Matt Baron Fortesque's Chaos Engine, a pretty cool name for a time machine I must add, broke down. And to get back to the original time, they have to work with and for the Baron to help him rebuild the contraption. The catch is, whomever helps him more will be rewarded with a trip back home, while the other will remain forever forgotten in endless strands of time. So, while in the first game both players work cooperatively, in Chaos Engine 2 they actually compete against each other. There's 4 characters to choose from, and they differ not only in how they look, but also weapons. As usual with those multiplayer ROMs, Chaos Engine 2 is considerably more fun when played with a person and not CPU, so make sure to have someone with you ready to pick up a gun and shoot some buddies. And slash or you. Yeah. The aim of each level is theoretically very simple, to pick up as many bonus points as humanly possible and find the key that will allow you to leave the level through exit before your opponent does. Now, how's that helpful with rebuilding the time machine? I will never understand, but it is what it is. I think that it's obvious that unlike first game, which was in large part about exploration and overcoming obstacles, working together towards the same goal, Chaos Engine 2 is an arena shooter. Beautifully designed, richly detailed and polished one, but arena shooter nonetheless. So all the typical strategies to this apply to it too, meaning you can hunt for your opponent actively, guns blazing, or you can ignore him and focus on completing the level as soon as you can. Or even camp somewhere, seemingly doing nothing, waiting for him to show up, just to down him when he least expects it, and pick up whatever he collected and drop dying, and anything in between. Like I said initially, Chaos Engine 2 is not a bad game at all. It's just literally not what the fans of the first one wanted. They hoped for more of the same and got the opposite. If you liked the first, I can't tell you how to feel about the second. You just gotta try it. But if you didn't, then it may be worth a go, provided you have someone else to play it against. The Citadel was what I called my bedroom when I was in high school, because it was locked off and nothing even remotely fun happened in there. Pretty sad, but true. But the Citadel that we'll talk about today came out in the same year behind the Iron Gate date that we spoke about just a few minutes ago, but other than sharing the same FPS roots, these 2 games felt as if they were at least a generation apart. Maybe 2. Nearly everything that behind the Iron Gate dropped the ball on, the Citadel did, and did well too. So it featured texture-mapped graphics, large lush levels with a lot to discover and a plethora of enemies to fight against, or run from, depending what weapon you were armed with and if you had enough ammo. And trust me, the firefights were brutal, the enemies were deadly, and the Citadel felt like Doom. Granted, a cut-down version of Doom, but all the makings of the great title were emulated accurately in their own unique way. The atmosphere of being alone trapped in a remote base filled with countless unspeakable alien horrors is nailed in this one, and feeling that you have no one else there with you to help you escape it was overwhelming. Sure, many technically better FPSs released on the Amiga within the next few years, but hardly any could compare in the atmosphere to the Citadel. It was the first real Doom clone on the system, and it was fun. And that's the most important thing about it, because while I can excuse a lot when it comes to the presentation when the game is fun, when it's not, it really doesn't matter how it looks. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Fears. The Citadel, like most early Amiga FPSs, does not show an on-screen weapon. It's a pity, but given everything else that it offers, it can be forgiven. Especially that it runs on all Amigas provided they have at least 1 MB of RAM. Sure, on A500 it ran in a window that couldn't be compared to anything else than the postal stamp, but it ran and was entirely playable, start to finish. And also, who hasn't played the FPS in a window 1/10 of the entire screen size, never played an Amiga FPS. It's an experience like no other, period. Oh, and the intro sequence to the Citadel is just phenomenal. It's beautifully pre-rendered, sci-fi themed, and even features some very basic FMV sequences. Yeah, on Amiga, in a disc-based game. If you wanna see first real FPS on the Amiga, this is the one to track down. A little earlier, I mentioned I tend to slip in mentions of Benefactor whenever I can, like now, here, a few minutes after we just spoke about it. But the number of times I talk about Deluxe Galaga easily dwarfs it. And no wonder, cause what I'm about to say is gonna be a bold, courageous statement, perhaps a little stupid too, and also one I will defend until the day I die. Deluxe Galaga is bar none the single best vertically scrolling shoot 'em up on the Amiga, and second best in existence out of all platforms, classic or otherwise. Only bettered by Warblade, made by the same developer on PC years later. Yeah, you may jump in the comments now, to let me know why you mistakenly think that I'm wrong. And yes, I realize that from the presentation stance, it has literally nothing to offer. It looked very dated when it released, it looks dated now, and it will even more so with each passing year. The sounds and music are also nothing to ponder about, they're there, they do their job, and are no better than in any other generic shooter. So, there's nothing more really that could be said about its presentation. Well, unless it's something like backgrounds in Deluxe Galaga are as dark and empty as my darkest thoughts every day when I wake up and think about the grim future. Or maybe something similar to most sprites in the game are as small and insignificant as my bank account balance. Or something down the lines of Snake on the Nokia phone had better sounds than this one does. You get the gist. It's not praiseworthy in this department whatsoever. But it's irrelevant, cause it shines the most, kinda like that bald spot you've been polishing with that questionable cream every day in hopes for it spawning a single hair or two, when it comes to playability. While based on original Galaga, it adds so much to the formula that it ends up being an original, unique experience that's much better played than watched or listened about. It features 75 levels, but completing them all does not end the game, just circles back to the first at increased speed and difficulty, so you can carry on ramping up the points forever until it's humanly impossible to go any further. Said levels are divided into smaller parts of 3 consecutive waves. First 2 being sort of introductions to new kinds of enemies, their attack patterns and capabilities, and third being a small bosses challenge in the theme of the first 2. We used to call those mini-bosses mothers back in the day, as they were just bigger, stronger and more resistant versions of the basic enemies. All these are interluded by alternating bonus or kamikaze stages. Earlier are risk-free levels for points and bonus upgrades, later are high-risk, high-reward waves of kamikaze enemy attacks, in which they drop on you quickly and are rather difficult to beat if you've not upgraded your weapons. As you play the game, you'll also be triggering bonus memory lane and meteor storm stages. The first is a basic game of memory, but with a twist that all the pairs that you manage to find are actually bonuses and add-ons for your ship. Second sees you navigating a fast-falling and filled with bonuses indestructible meteors against the clock. The faster and further you get, the more points you will accumulate. Completing this incredibly punishing stage also rewards a lot of money, that then can be later on spent in the shop to purchase very powerful weapons. So having beat it early on can pretty much guarantee a successful run. Every 25 levels you encounter a huge boss that is considerably more demanding and dangerous than anything before, and will require memorization of its attack and movement patterns and ninja-like dexterity to beat it. Naturally, approaching this with basic or low-power weapons is a recipe for failure and a shortcut to death. And you know what? Everything I told you about is just scratching the surface, as there's not only much more to Deluxe Galaga, but also a whole plethora of secrets that can make the game easier and more fun, provided you discover them, that is. But you'll just have to play it to experience it, and not just take my word for it. Deluxe Galaga is so feature-rich that it never gets stale, and while looking like a tiny little itty-bitty step-up in presentation to 8-bit original, it's actually incredibly fun and addicting game for 1 or 2 players. Cooperatively or alternating, however you wanna play it, it's easily a title worth a whole evening of gaming. It's not very often that the best game in a genre on the Amiga comes from a small developer, from a country that was not well known for great games, and all that at the very tail end of system's life. And here, that's precisely the case. Doman is a game that has a lot of issues, starting with constant load times that are a nightmare. Disk drive seems to be in an overdrive between each and every group of enemies, or like a bus length or half whale of walking distance on the screen. The game keeps loading something all the freaking time. And if it wouldn't have came out in 1995, I would have sworn that it just keeps making a local copy of the internet on floppies. Then there's the graphics. And I'll give them that, they have their own unique charm, but they're also a definition of cringe. And finally, the game's in Polish only. I mean, no one cares about the story in a walking beat-em-ups, but if you're an exception confirming that rule, then you're not gonna understand anything, as Doman never received an English version. And since it's 2023, we can safely assume that it never will. All that aside, it's a unique and very well put together title. A medieval-themed low-fantasy beat-em-up that's best known for its abundance of blood and gore, all the bodybuilders, LARPing Conan the Barbarian and the likes, and muscles in places you never knew muscles could exist. Granted, I'm no doctor or PE teacher and have no deep understanding of a human body, so perhaps a double bicep is just fine. Then there are two characters to choose from, or players in co-op for that matter. And both of these medieval Slavic beefcakes that the players can lead have a variety of different attacks that are also weapon dependent, meaning each weapon has a set of their own attack and finisher animations, and they can be exchanged at various specific points during gameplay, so you'll have plenty enough time to try them all out and find your favorites. In the end, Doman is a surprisingly playable title that no one expected to be good at all. And perhaps because of that, since there were no overwhelming expectations for it to reach any particular milestones or have certain features, it managed to do its own thing and in the process become one of the better original exclusive beat-em-ups on the Amiga. It also uses any additional hardware you can throw at it, so the faster CPU and more RAM you'll have, the better it will look, sound and run. So, if you're into the genre, or just want to lose few minutes cutting heads off or bashing bodies, and don't mind the immersion-breaking loading, it's an excellent title for that purpose. Some of you know of my hate towards Body Blows games, for how empty and a shell of the games that they are, offering very little to anyone who's ever played a real good versus fighter. And Elfmania, well, it's an interesting case of same but different, but we'll circle back to it in a minute. Story-wise, the king of Mumulandia is ready to step down and find a worthy successor, but leading the kingdom of elves is an honor, and only the one quote-unquote worthy can do so. So, he decides that whomever defeats him in combat will not only be worthy, but also powerful enough to lead and defend the elves if the need ever occurs. In Elfmania, you're not bound to stick into a single fighter, and with enough money earned during fights for successful attacks, you can purchase other, seemingly better ones and switch to them. And while all of the available characters look entirely different, they actually kinda play samey. I mean, sure, the more expensive fighters do actually hit stronger, but you don't really play them any different than you would have those that you start with. At least I don't. And perhaps I've been playing the game wrong all along. Feel free to correct me in the comments. All that sadly means that the recipe for success is to keep fighting weak opponents, saving up money for better fighters, then doing the exact same thing with the better ones until you get to the best, and only then to challenge the king. Perhaps it's a fresh take on the fighter formula, but it's not very fun and very grindy. So yeah, if you feel like I was trying to tell you that Elfmania is boring and not very fun, you got my intentions just right. But despite all that, just look at it. It's a beauty. And how smooth it runs. It's a testament to what the system was capable of with great graphic artists and top-of-the-class programmers. Because clearly that's who Elfmania had on the roster. If it only had a decent game designer, then perhaps we'd end up with a fun and beautiful game on our hands and not just an Amiga's graphics capabilities show-off. I won't recommend playing Elfmania to you today, as it's not great. But if it's a toss between it and Body Blows, always, and I mean it, always go for a different game and not Body Blows. So, second episodes behind us and the games that were never released on any other system than the Ami. How did you like those? Any you'd like to try out? Perhaps it's time to fire up the emulation and check what you missed all those years ago playing on PC or consoles. Or perhaps you had an Amiga and this was just a trip down the memory lane for you. Whichever the case may be, make sure to let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit those like and subscribe buttons below. If you didn't, well then there's thumbs down there too. But I suppose you wouldn't have persevered up to this point if you really didn't. Around 60% of you are not subscribed and there's currently no way of knowing if YouTube will decide to recommend you the next episode or not. Other than subscribing and hitting that bell, that is. And when you hit that bell, whenever the new video is out, YouTube will actually send you a small and friendly notification about it, so you wouldn't miss it. If you'd like to support the channel, Patreon and YouTube memberships are a great way of doing so. They will help me release better content and also they get first dibs on all new videos before they're publicly accessible on YouTube. If you can't or don't want to do that though, likes and subscribes are great too. I would like to take a moment here and thank all the YouTube creators from whose videos short bits were taken to serve as a background to my commentary. They're amazing and stars among the retro community. You will find names of their channels at the top of the screen when their footage is running and also in the video description below. For me though, this is all, so have a good one and I'll see you next time. Peace.